glad to be here, and I very much appreciate all of you attending as well. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker, Kalisha Webster. She is a senior housing advocate at Housing Choices, an organization serving people with development, mental, and other disabilities wanting to live independently in their communities. Kalisha trains and organizes self-advocates to educate local elected officials, city and county housing staff, and housing developers about opportunities to plan for and include people with developmental and other disabilities in their local housing plans. Her advocacy is focused on getting cities to adopt more inclusive housing policies as part of their housing elements, as well as advocating to affordable housing developers to include preferences in a certain number of units for people with developmental disabilities. She has also hosted several workshops on the increased barriers to housing access and opportunities for persons with intersectional identities, being Black, Indigenous, or persons of color with a disability, as compared to white persons with disabilities or BIPOC without disabilities. Welcome, Kalisha.
Thank you, Dana, for that introduction. I'm happy to be here.
Well, fantastic. Just briefly, our format tonight is question and answer, followed with us taking open questions from you all. Let's get started. Kalisha, tell us more about Housing Choices.
Yeah, absolutely. So Housing Choices was founded 25 years ago in Santa Clara County as an advocacy group made up of self-advocates, their parents, and supportive service providers who found that people with developmental disabilities were being excluded from local housing plans due to the lack of affordable housing. Over the years, Housing Choices has expanded our role as a service provider, offering both housing access and retention services to regional center consumers who want to live independently in their community. We support consumers and their families through every step of the housing process, including searching and applying for housing. And then after move-in, our resident coordinators offer on-site supportive services at our partner properties, which are affordable housing properties where a certain number of units have been set aside for regional center consumers who benefit from our on-site case management and service coordination to help them remain stably housed. With our partner properties, Housing Choices' goal is to create more opportunities for people with developmental disabilities to live in integrated community housing. Currently, we have served over 300 residents in 22 partner properties across the 5 counties in San Andreas and Golden Gate Regional Center service areas, with 21 new partner properties in some stage of lease-up or planning.
Fantastic. I mean, most of us are familiar with individuals with developmental disabilities, either directly or indirectly. But tell me about the relationship between disability and race, and how can people advocate for this intersectionality in housing access?
Sure. So when we're looking at identity with an intersectional lens, we're looking at how 2 different aspects of a person's identity can affect each other. It was originally coined as a term to talk about the differences in employment trends for women of color as compared to men of color and white women, but can be equally applied to disability justice. This is because typically when looking at fair housing issues, we talk about race and disability as being 2 separate categories of discrimination. But when we look at these issues with an intersectional lens, we find that a person of color with a disability faces increased challenges and barriers than either a white person with a disability or a person of color without a disability. And really what sparked us having these conversations in 2020 during the first wave of the pandemic and the racial justice protests, the National Disability Institute released an update to the 2017 report Financial Inequality, Disability, Race, and Poverty in America, in which they explored the effects of race and ethnicity on prevalence of disability status, as well as educational attainment and financial security for people of color with disabilities. These articles sparked some of the questions for us locally as they address some of the issues we have witnessed for years and have been trying to disrupt as a housing provider for people with disabilities in one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. And
Right.
that the main issue is that we see is that Black people, Indigenous, and people of color face greater barriers to housing access than white persons with disabilities or persons of color without disabilities.
So what is an example of these increased barriers?
Sure. So some of these inequities include lower incomes, less access to services needed to live independently, higher rates of housing cost burden, meaning that they are paying a much larger share of their monthly income towards rent. And in general, we're seeing that less are being able to find housing or are being um, targeted for housing that is available.
Great. So how is Housing Choices increasing capacity? Specifically in these areas for those that are both disabled and belong to a marginalized racial group.
Absolutely. So for years, Housing Choices and the regional centers have been looking at disparities in services provided to consumers by race and ethnicity and have tried to find solutions to overcome some of these barriers in order to make our services more culturally competent and accessible for persons for whom English may not be their first or primary language, as well as for other BIPOC populations. Housing Choices has really prioritized hiring staff who reflect the population that we serve. Currently, over 90% of our staff are people of color, 75% are bilingual in a language important to the communities we serve, including Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin, and Tagalog. We also implemented, excuse my pronunciation here, Navegador de Vivienda, a project to promote awareness of options for independent living in the Spanish-speaking community. We adopted diversity, equity, and inclusion goals for board recruitment, succession planning, and board priorities. Recruited and trained people of color to tell their housing stories and housing element other community meetings, as well as developed and implemented workshops on intersectionality of race and disabilities in San Mateo and Santa Clara County, and discuss different points in the system where barriers may exist and promote equitable solutions. We also made sure to really center the voices of people with lived experiences in these workshops by including clients to talk about their experiences trying to find housing. And we have since brought different versions of the same workshop to affordable housing and disability advocacy groups, as well as directly to cities interested in creating more inclusive communities. However, we know that there's still room for improvements to be made. And in 2021, we signed onto the Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits Racial Equity Pledge with an intended goal of not only increasing the cultural competence of our services, but also the overall culture of our organization. This is including creating more leadership roles within our organization for people of color. Our former executive director, Jan Stokely, really prioritized this by making sure to mentor people who are already within our organization, as we already are a staff that's mostly people of color, making sure we're creating leadership roles for people who are already here and promoting them rather than looking outside of our organization for fulfilling those leadership roles. And I was, I benefited from her mentorship myself. I originally started out as a housing coordinator in San Mateo County and started doing some housing advocacy work as I was a housing coordinator, and was eventually able to become a full-time senior housing advocate.
Great. I know that you mentioned some of the disparities. Can you highlight maybe, what the most significant ones are that are still remaining that need to be really focused on?
Sure. So we would definitely say that the greatest barriers are uh, the housing cost burden, meaning that people with disabilities who are living independently typically are spending a much larger share of their their monthly income on housing, which means that they are at greater risk of housing instability. Um, and So on a local level in San Mateo County, when comparing people with and without disabilities, we find that having a disability correlates with increased rent burden. But then when adding the compounding factors of race and ethnicity, we find that rent burden is much greater for people of color with disabilities than for white people with disabilities. Black people with a disability are more than twice as likely to experience rent burden than Black people without a disability or white person with a disability. The same is found when comparing Latinx people with a disability to white people with a disability. And while Asian people with and without disabilities experience rent burden at a higher rate than white people with and without disabilities, we do not find such a drastic difference.
Hmm. You mentioned earlier Article 34. It was kind of new to me. What is Article 34 and why is it so important to repeal it?
Absolutely. So Article 34 was enacted. So most of us have heard about redlining, which was a discriminatory practice that banks used to deny loans to people living in neighborhoods they deemed to be hazardous investments, which is code for neighborhoods that had high concentrations of racial and ethnic minorities. So during that same period in time that banks were redlining these neighborhoods throughout the country, California decided to take segregation a step further by amending the state's constitution and adding Article 34, which prohibits cities and counties from creating affordable housing directly. So public housing is cannot be created in California without having some kind of a referendum on the ballot. So it needs the public needs to be completely behind any kind of housing that gets built using public dollars. And the reason that this is kind of an issue is because it was really geared at trying to keep lower income people of color out of these higher resource areas, these higher income, mostly white single family home neighborhoods. And we see this being an issue because so we see this being an issue because it not only affects people of color, it affects people with disabilities who tend to need that public housing. And in California, we have this what's called NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard, very well-known housing opposite of supporting. So they're going out and they're going to these meetings and they're saying, housing is great, but not here, right? So they're keeping people who need that housing, who need that deeply affordable housing out of their communities is really what they're trying to do. They're trying to exclude people. And so even though this was focused on people of color, it affects people with disabilities as well. And so we see this as a really key way to creating more housing opportunities for people with disabilities to live in any part of the community wherever they've grown up, making sure that they're not excluded from any certain neighborhoods. Especially because living in a resource-rich neighborhood is very important for a person with a disability, as they rely on access to transit, access to amenities, in order to live independently.
Kind of a final question. Having Choices is known as a service provider. LSA is a service provider providing residential care. What are some ways that providers like us can work together to further diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Sure. So we really promote looking internally at how can your organization best serve the community that you're working with. So one of the things that we've done is looking at statistics of who is the regional center serving and is that matching up with who we as an organization are serving? Are we meeting all the people that are most in need? And also because we know from this intersectional lens that a person of color faces increased barriers to housing access. We should see that in fact our people that we're serving, our clients are, typically the people that need the most housing, who are facing these greatest challenges in order to increase equity. So looking at internally how you're best meeting the need, and then looking at how can you go out into the community and advocate for change. How can you spread information to people who maybe aren't aware of the housing inequities for people with disabilities, especially for people of color with disabilities. Going to public meetings and letting your community leaders know about the need for housing access for persons with disabilities.
Yeah, fantastic. So that ends the formal questions, and we'd like to now, open it up for Q&A.
Yes, and thank you, Dana, and thank you so much, Kalisha. really enjoying the topic of conversation tonight, as I know there's a lot of times that there's frustration about a problem, but no one's really talking about it in public platforms. And it was important for us as an organization tonight to really put this on the top of our docket this year, as we've been finding diversity, equity, inclusion increasingly important for innovation, but then also in order to build for the future. And so we're going to open up our Q&A panel tonight so that you can ask Kalisha some questions. And again, the way where you find that is right down at the bottom of your panel if you're in the app online. And then you want to use the specific widget here that says Q&A, and that'll give questions directly to us so that we can answer, and we can answer those questions live. You're also welcome to ask those questions anonymously if there's questions that you want to ask. I do have a question that came in that I just want to top off. It seems like, again, as we talked about, there's a big problem that a lot of people are frustrated with, and we can't help everyone. We all know that we're limited in capacity, both Housing Choices and LSA. But one of the reasons why we've done these IDD topics and trends is to share knowledge. And I heard Kalisha talk a lot about that tonight, about sharing knowledge. And so I want to pass this question along, coming from one of our attendees tonight. She's in North Carolina. But the connections are similar, and that she wants to start something that matters. She too has a developmentally disabled young man with with severe autism, I should say, and she's trying to find out whether or not she can open this group home. But she says she's meeting with a lot of issues. So she wants to know how to start and who to talk to in her home state of North Carolina. Can you both just take a couple of stabs at that? And I'll punt that over to you, Dana, first. And then Kalisha, maybe you just kind of follow up with some helpful maybe tips or tricks that she can try in her home state. And then we've also taken down this woman's email information so that we can continue on the conversation and connect it with some of the resources that we know span nationwide. Dana, can you talk about how to start if you were in North Carolina in this woman's shoes?
Yeah, sure, Adia. It's a question that comes up from time to time, and basically, and I'm happy to be a resource to anyone who's interested in pursuing it. Environments might be different in North Carolina than California, but I think they're basically the same. And any kind of group housing tends to, require licenses and comes with a whole lot of regulations and requirements. And it tends to make it, quite a significant adventure. It's completely non-trivial. And typically you have to acquire control of a house. You have to apply for and get the licenses. And it requires typically a fairly significant investment in time and money. And most of the time when I go through that, families look at it and say, oh my God, that's that's way beyond anything that we can tackle. But if I was going to give some advice, it would be to find somebody who is doing that and who seems to be doing it well and has a good reputation, and then approach them to pick their brain. And just like here, I'd say we're a good organization to approach and pick our brain because we've done it. We've actually, since I joined LSA, we've opened 12 homes. And so if you do something 12 times, you typically get either pretty good at it or you're crazy. So Yes, I hope that helped, and I'd be happy to talk offline.
Thank you so much, Dana. And again, we've went ahead and grabbed this woman's email address, and happy to do that. But before we do, Kalisha, can you add anything to that? Is there something that specifically she wanted to talk about government grants and findings or findings for housing for people with disabilities? And I know that many moons ago, Kalisha, that's something that you also worked within as far as advocacy. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Sure. So I would say, that's really an issue that we've also been talking about at Housing Choices for years. Is why is there a lack of funding that's really geared towards people with disabilities? So if you're familiar with Section 8 program, which is federal rental subsidies, and just sorry to kind of start, Housing Choices we don't do any kind of group homes. We do community housing. So Section 8 is for rental subsidies, so people can live in the community at an affordable rate, and the federal government subsidizes part of their rent to make the housing more affordable. And they have a specialized program called Section 811, which is specifically for people with disabilities, but they have to be either institutionalized or at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And they also have to be between the ages of 18 and 62. So it leaves out a lot of people, right? It leaves out families with children. It leaves out older adults. And so it's really a very targeted program, which is very much needed and very much meets a need. But it's limited and unfortunately doesn't go far enough. I think they've maybe given out a few grants here and there over the years. In the last year or two, I don't think that there's been any Section 811 money. And so it really limits the housing opportunities for people with disabilities. As far as I know, there aren't really any other targeted programs that are for people with disabilities on a federal level. On a state level, there's definitely nothing that exists like that. I don't know about North Carolina. They might have something, other programs. And that's something that we've really advocated for in California. So people with mental health disorders have specific funds, people who are homeless have specific funds, but people with developmental disabilities, there's not a specific fund to help them stay housed. Even though a majority of people with developmental disabilities aren't working, right? They're dependent on Social Security income. In North Carolina, I'm not sure exactly what Social Security income is, but I know that in California, it's $1,000 per month. And when rents are $2,000-3,000 a month, you're never going to be able to find housing. Even affordable housing isn't going to be affordable enough, typically.
And just to add, from my standpoint, we also see very little funding directed at housing. And it's one of the reasons why LSA has relied very heavily on donations from individuals to be able to raise the money necessary to buy the homes. And it's not to say that there's none, but it certainly has tended to be limited. And in California, it's been limited to creating capacity for those coming out of institutions that have been closed. And we often advocate for, more, they're called community placement plan funds, more funds to be made available to regional centers to fund capacity increases. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, in Kalisha's world and in my world, we see, demand much greater than capacity. And that means that there are people, who are waiting for that kind of an opportunity for housing and to live that life.
Yes,
Oh.
definitely. One thing I would say that's really alarming for us is we're seeing, while it's great that the state has really focused on getting people out of these segregated institutions. In most communities that we serve, 70 to 90, 100% of adults with developmental disabilities are living in the family home. So what happens to those adults as they age in place, right? Where do they transition to when their parents are no longer able to provide housing for them? So that's a real concern. I'm sure Dana could talk to you about how challenging it is for them to to open up new group homes. And throughout the state, we've actually seen a decline in the number of group homes being opened. So affordable housing is really one of the main kind of solutions that we really promote.
And just because I'm gonna pretend as if I don't know, which I don't know. Kalisha, can you tell us why is it that we've seen a decline in group housing?
Absolutely. And actually the data might be able to tell us that too, but what we've really seen is that in California, housing is really expensive. I'm not sure if you guys don't know that, but yeah. So at the end of the day, when it comes time for a person an owner of one of these group homes to retire, um, it's actually more financially beneficial for them to sell that house as a residence rather than as a business. So we're seeing people retiring, and there's not enough housing being there's not enough new businesses being open um, to to meet the need to
To
sorry
replace them?
to replace them. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, no, it
Yeah.
makes total sense. It makes total sense,
Oh,
Dana.
my spin on it is that ultimately the cost of the housing has gone up faster than, the funding. And, our population, is very dependent on public funds, whether they be, SSI, or whether they be funds, regional center provided funds for services. And so to the extent that the reimbursement rate for the services has gone up slower than the costs of housing, it's squeezed. And the result has been, and I think, Housing Choices identified this, has been more homes closing than opening, and essentially uh, the homes moving towards lower cost areas in the state, Central Valley, which often takes that developmentally disabled person maybe out of the family home and forces them to move far away from their community, from their family member, from where they're connected, and just to be able to find that housing. So we're hopeful that some of this is being addressed by the rate study and implementation of the new rate structure that should allow funding to be more adequate and follow costs. For example, one of the things that is done that was not done before is they recognize that costs aren't the same in every area of California. And so if you're in Bay Area or LA, there's a higher allowance in the rate for housing, as well as other costs of living and wages. So yeah, I mean, before it was the same in Eureka as in San Jose, same rate. In fact, they were always rates were always compressed to the mean, which over time I think cost a lot of service providers to go out of business.
I wanna segue back here because the thing that I heard Kalisha say tonight, and I think it's important that we uh, bring this question up. There's quite a few questions that are coming in through our Q&A, which I'm really excited about. My I guess my question for you, Kalisha, and I want to kind of put it in context here. You said that there was quite a few extenuating factors that would keep someone who is disabled, developmentally disabled, from finding housing and finding some lasting solutions, if you will. Um, and you said that goes up quite a bit higher in terms of obstacles if that person is a person of color. So in your opinion, what's the main reason? This is one of the questions. What is the main reason why so many people of color are often overlooked when it comes to housing choices?
That's a great question. I think that's the question of the year, right? Of the time, is why are people of color overlooked in opportunities, for a number of reasons, right? So I would say that a really big challenge is, um, cultural competency in how services are delivered to people of color, making sure that we're outreaching to people in a culturally competent way, making sure they understand what services are available to them, but also making sure that we are checking our own personal biases. Um, so I'll use an example from one of our clients who has been in a multitude of our workshops. He's very open about his story. He has had the goal of living independently for many years. Had talked to his social worker at the regional center about this several times. Um, they weren't able to offer anything to him other than a group home, but that wasn't his what was in his IPP, what was in his program plan. What he said his goal was to live independently, but the only thing they offered him was a group home because they didn't think that he was able to live independently. And it's really unfortunate that that was, the position he was put in. He tried it out; it wasn't the right fit for him. He didn't. He lived there for maybe less than a year. And even though Housing Choices has been working with the regional center at this point for a couple of years, we didn't actually get the referral for this client until we were, put in touch with his mother by a completely third entity. So he had never even been told about Housing Choices services by his social worker, even though we had already been working with the regional center. Um, why is that? I couldn't tell you, but one can make some assumptions about that there's personal biases. He didn't feel the need to tell him about a resource that was available to help him find housing that he wanted because he didn't think that he was ready to. And why that is, we can't say for certain that there's a racial aspect to that, but certainly that's something that could have impacted his decision making. Um,
Wow.
and that's the case for a lot of people with developmental disabilities. That's why the DDS has really started to look at disparities in who's receiving services and what services they're receiving.
Speaking of, there's a couple more questions. I'm just going to combine them into one. If you've been asking questions in the chat, thank you so much for sticking around. We want to get to all of them. I'm going to start trying to combine a couple, seeing if we can answer them. And Dana, help Kalisha kind of tag team some of these if you can.
Sure.
But I know that this next one is kind of a segue for you, Kalisha. And it was just saying that for minorities who received housing for the IDD loved ones, how has it changed their lives? And when people become aware of this, or as they're unaware, how has it changed, or I guess prevented them from their lives being changed? If you can answer that, like what have you seen as the difference for these people of color, these people who've received housing and their minorities?
So actually, I'll go back to that same client. So I was actually the housing coordinator working with him. He was referred to us back in 2020. And just this year, we were able to get him housed into one of our partner properties in San Jose, which was really a life-changing experience for him. We still work closely with him and with his mother. They're great housing advocates for people with developmental disabilities. And his mom has really, always praised us so much on being able to help him to get into this housing. She talked about how it's completely changed kind of his outlook and his self-worth about himself. She said, he used to be a very, very, very shy person, very nonverbal at times. And she said, he's really opened up, really blossomed, doing the advocacy work, getting into his own apartment. She's seen what a difference it's made, how much happier he seems to be out of the family home, to be in his own apartment. For years he had seen his younger siblings moving out and going into college and moving into their own housing, and now he's feeling like he can have those opportunities too.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Can we turn back for a second? because we talked about affordable housing, and we kind of talked about it in this kind of gray area. Dana, in your opinion, what would you consider affordable housing in the San Jose area? Someone said in the Q&A that they went down to Gilroy and that the person was rent was less than $300, and that it was Section 8, but Kalisha was talking about it earlier tonight, and the rent in this area, obviously. What do you, in your opinion, what is affordable?
So
Yeah,
there,
for me,
go ahead, sorry.
or I was
Go
going to
ahead,
say,
Dana.
go ahead, Kalisha. I'll put my 2 cents in after you.
Oh, I'm so sorry if I spoke over you, Dana. I was just going to say that,
Okay.
there's the state and federal definition of affordability, and then there's what we know to be affordable, right? So the state and federal definition of affordability is based on area median income. So if you live in an area like the Bay Area, where the area median income for a single person is $120,000 per year, if you're making $1,000 per month, which is about $12,000 per year, you're making less than 20% of what the average person is in your area. And typical in affordable housing, there's different levels. So there's 30% of area median income, there's 50% of area median income, 80% of area median income. So if your only income source is Social Security income, you do not have high enough income to meet the typical affordable housing rent. And that's specific to the Bay Area. Now, if you live in a cheaper area or a lower income area where an area is defined by your county, if you live in a lower income county, so maybe the area median income is obviously less than 6 figures, then you might be able to apply for affordable housing. But here in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, the areas that we serve, that's not a possibility for people's Social Security income. And Section 8, what's really great about that program is that rather than basing it on area median income, it bases it on the tenant's income. So you only pay 30% of your household income towards rent. And that's why in the case of the person in Gilroy, they were able to pay only $300, because if your household income is only $1,000 per month, you only pay 30% of that towards rent with Section 8.
That was a great explanation. I'm so glad that I let you go first. I was going to just add I guess a parent's perspective, and I think you really nailed it when SSI is not bigger if you live in a higher cost area. It's the same, and so it's much like we were talking about before. The costs are quite different. So in this case, the cost of renting, but the SSI is a constant. My son has his own place, and the reason he does is because he was able to sign up on the waiting list for Section 8 and wait 5 or 10 years before he got it. And so he gets Section 8, and he has that low income and is able to pay affordable rents. But this is the challenge for so many, and the patience required. And I think if you overlay on top of that any other barriers, then it becomes almost insurmountable. And so we see a lot of people, forced to maybe to live in a situation that's not ideal. It's so great to hear that story of someone, and I relate it back to person-centered thinking and person-centered listening, and really, really trying to shut out all of that noise and understand what this individual wanted, and that led to coming up with a life-altering situation. And I think that's where we have to kind of check our personal biases, is not to be making too many assumptions about what people want. And yeah.
Yeah, it seems like we have a couple of questions. I'm not going to combine them. That wants to talk about which states are better in terms of lower barriers to opening a group home, and then also the efficacy, the financial efficacy of group homes versus SLS in California. And I know that we have a webinar that we've done, I think last year, a couple of them actually, that talk about both SLS in California, particularly in this area. But then also we have a webinar that talks about community care facilities and what it takes to open those homes. But Dana, can you give us kind of a one-liner on both, on which states are better, in your opinion, in terms of low barriers to open a group home, which state is easiest to open up a group home, and then talk about the efficacy financially for both group homes versus supported living services?
The first one, my honest answer is I really don't know, because I'm just not familiar with other states. I hear from a lot of people that, and this would date back decades, that, you know, if you have a developmentally disabled child, California is a really good state to live in. And many states do not offer some of the services and supports that are considered an entitlement by law here in California. But beyond that, I'm not able to comment on opening a group home in another state. The second one, you know, supported living is just a different model, and it's great. You know, one is great for some, and the other is great for some. You know, and a lot of it kind of comes down to, you know, what sort of social type person are you? And in a group home setting, there's an opportunity for a lot more socialization, whether it's you know, with your roommates or with the staff or any combination thereof. In supported living, often you know, one lives with, as the saying goes, paid staff. So Brent's friends, you know, are his paid staff. Well, it turns out, you know, they're a lot more than just paid staff, but, you know, he doesn't have the benefit and supported living of having 4 roommates. So what it's best to look at them within the context of that person and what's, you know, best for that person. Financially, it's completely, well, there's no talk of money. You know, if you're entitled to the service, the state of California pays the service provider for the service. In reality, supported living is a very expensive service, because it tends to not have the economies that come with a group living situation. But, you know, parents are not expected to pay for services, and therefore, you know, in theory, the system can work hard at finding the right service for someone. But as I'm sure Kalisha will point out, and her example is a good one, that's not always easy. And we depend on the social worker in that process. And in many cases, you know, there's a high level of turnover, and you may get a service provider or service coordinator or social worker who's not that familiar with what's available, or what's available might not be, as we talked before, in sufficient capacity.
Sure. So I want to wrap us up. We're just about at time, but I wanted to end with this one question, and then kind of a positive note. So Kalisha, this last one's for you. It's, what kind of experiences, you know, discrimination have people of color with disabilities faced over the years? And if we can look backwards, then I promise to end on a happier note on what we can do in the future to try to address some of these things. Kalisha, can you just bring us up to speed with history?
Sorry, sorry, I'm so sorry.
The history of, it's okay, the history of people with color who have had disabilities. What type of discrimination have they faced over the years?
So we see that a person of color with a disability faces, as I've been saying this whole time, there's compounding issues, right? So a person with disability might face discrimination based on their disability status. So I've worked with clients who maybe had a child with autism or some other disability, and we've had a property manager come back and say, oh, well, we can't rent to this person because this child may have behaviors that disturb other tenants, which is a fair housing issue, right? It's a discrimination based on the person's disability status. And then we may have someone have complaints because of their race, or they might be discriminated against because of their race. So we're seeing that with a person with a disability and who is a person of color, that they see greater barriers to housing because of they might have someone who doesn't want to rent to them because of their race, and finds a reason based on their disability. I don't know if I have like a specific scenario that I can really talk to here.
I think there's plenty. Some of the things that we were doing in research for this particular talk was looking through some of the research and the studies that have been done that include, we talked about this when we were doing the rehearsal, that if there is a woman who's disabled, she has a barrier against her, but if she's disabled and a woman and a person of color, then it's extremely hard. And we were joking that at the time I was all three as we were doing research for this talk. Perhaps a good follow-up even to this talk would be to share some of those papers that have been done and the research that's been done, so that some of our viewers, if they're interested, can look into it even further. I think that it's definitely been eye-opening as far as for how we do things. I think another thing is being really surprised that even in our area, in the Santa Clara County area, that there's a wide range of people of color who have developmental disabilities and who are clients through the regional center. And then realizing that if we just take a look around at the things that are being offered to them, as you mentioned tonight, that we're finding that they're not even being mentioned, our names, housing choices, or life services alternatives, which kind of brings me to my last point. And this turns to one of our viewers tonight who's been really active on chat. And I want to thank her for all of her comments and questions. But she says that this is a comment rather than a question. Sweetwater Spectrum, more of an international community or farmstead rather than a group home, was asked so much about how to replicate their model. And they've dedicated a good chunk of their website to outreach training, if you will. LSA certainly has been more than successful than many other entities. Okay, so she says it's an intentional community, not an international community. And so she says, LSA certainly has been more successful than many other entities. Maybe we want to do something like that. So I just want to say yes and amen, right? That's the goal, right? The goal is to share knowledge. And I think that there is no one magic pill or one magic bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, so much as it is community. Thus the reason why we've been doing IDD topics and trends and having you on tonight, Kalisha. The goal of this is to share resources. The goal of this is to create that community. As we've already seen tonight, someone's calling in from North Carolina. We're not going to be able to help everyone, but we can duplicate our knowledge, and we can share our knowledge and pass that around. So I want to invite everyone who's joined us tonight to share about housing choices, and also to share about LSA and the things that we're doing, and invite more people to reach out to us. In fact, in a second here, I'm going to share Kalisha's information with everyone. And then I'll share LSA's information with everyone to continue the conversation, where you may not have spare time, but you might be able to pass on a quick note and continue the conversation via email. We would certainly love to talk to you. This is Kalisha's information. This is also her website. To find out more about who Kalisha is, you can go to LinkedIn. And then for us, you can connect with us on all of our social channels. And then, of course, www.lsahomes.org is a great place to reach out to us. Connect with us via info@lsahomes.org. We love to talk to you more about some of the things that you heard tonight. I think finally, we just want to thank you and ask you to join us for our next session. We're going to continue to have conversations like this throughout the next month. Maybe not specifically in this vein, but definitely in things like severe autism, where we'll have a very, very remarkable woman, Jill Escher, join us on our next talk. And she's going to be talking about one of the organizations that she works with, which actually deals directly with autism. Also, just to say that there's many obstacles and barriers that I think a lot of us face on a daily basis. But LSA, Housing Choices, and many other organizations out there, we're working really hard to find solutions that create capacity, that tear down barriers, and of course, have inclusivity for all different types of walks of life who may have a developmental disability, but particularly within our area. We invite and encourage you to reach out to Kalisha, also to reach out to Dana, and to continue that conversation so that innovation can happen.
Could I interrupt for a second?
Absolutely.
I really wanted to thank Kalisha for joining us, and I also wanted to ask her one final question.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is, what can we all do to help support housing choices?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Dana. And thank you again for inviting me to be here, for everyone for being here, for listening to what we have to say tonight. Yeah, if you go onto our website, you can see, learn more about our organization. We do accept donations, like Dana said. Donations are a big part of how we get our work done. So in order to get people a house, we also help them with getting their first apartment set up. So we take donations to help with getting those apartments set up. We also are looking for people who want to tell their own housing stories and share their stories with local community leaders and affordable housing developers to get more awareness about the need for affordable housing for people with disabilities.
Awesome. That's awesome. I thank you so much, Dana. I almost signed us out without talking about the important things, the reason why we're all here. I do want to say that our teams went ahead and dropped the links, important links, into the chat for you if you wanted to copy and paste into your browser. Also, our next chat in the browser, in the chat for you. And then there's, again, quite lively conversation in the chat and in the Q&A. Please do not be a stranger. Reach out. We love talking to people like you. And Dana is a man true to his word. If he says he's going to help you, he's going to help you. So please do reach out via info@lsahomes.org. Kalisha, did we say thank you already? I don't think we did. I don't think we said thank you enough. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was, again, very informative. And Dana, thank you for your time, for listening. And then also giving, I guess, a great chat. Good talk, Dana. If you're willing, Kalisha, we'd love to have you back again soon.
Yes, absolutely. It's been a pleasure being here tonight. And thank you guys again for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye, everybody.